for the opportunity to rise on behalf of my community of Toronto St. Paul's. Over 60% of us in St. Paul's are renters. Tonight, I am fighting for our renters who deserve and need full support from this Conservative government, especially now during this pandemic and well into our recovery. As such, my motion calls on the Ontario government, as part of an affordable housing strategy and efforts to protect renters, to implement an immediate ban on above-guideline rent increases to protect tenants and their wallets until at least 12 months after the official end of the COVID-19 pandemic. After all, housing is a human right, and we shouldn't have people now more than ever worried and anxious about affordability. Not only has there been a real affordable housing and homelessness crisis in Ontario well before COVID, but we have seen individuals and families lose their homes, in essence, their very sense of safety, well-being and dignity during the pandemic. My community members and others across our province shouldn't have to live in fear of bad faith landlords using this government's above-guideline rent increase loophole to increase tenants' rents, especially during a pandemic. While the government has claimed to offer a rent freeze for 2021, the government has not stopped AGI increases. Landlords can still apply for and receive AGIs during the pandemic, which means more debt for tenants. St. Paul tenants have expressed bad faith landlords using AGIs as a backdoor method to try to recover some of the rent increases they're unable to legally get from their tenants during 2021. The wealthy landlords, the Starlights, the Achilleuses, the Caprites of the world shouldn't be able to make a profit on the back of tenants who are vulnerable during the pandemic. And this government has the power to stop that today. What the government has in place currently is not complete legislation. It is incomplete, offering a temporary rent freeze that expires on December 31st, 2021, an arbitrary date. The government is fully aware that the pandemic and its effects are not going to magically disappear on December 31st. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their livelihood by no fault of their own. Many are right here in our city and our province. The year before COVID arrived, our unemployment rate in St. Paul's was higher than Toronto as a whole. Our people have lost jobs because of the pandemic. These have included women, part-time workers, BIPOC community members, and those working in retail, hospitality, gig economy workers, artists, cultural workers, among others, who even before the pandemic were overrepresented in cycles of precarious, underpaid work. Bless you. Many of our essential workers, as we know, have struggled with covering rent. They've missed pay staying home sick or tending to sick kids and grandparents as essential caregivers. Too many in St. Paul's are paying more than 30% of their gross income for rent. Some have told me they're paying upwards of 50% and are living paycheck to paycheck and just can't afford any more expenses. And that's exactly what AGIs are. We've got 7 food banks in St. Paul's, 4 hot meal programs, and 6 out of the cold programs / drop-in shelters. We've got local community initiatives like One to Give and Seeds of Hope Foundation, supporting our frontline healthcare workers, essential workers, education workers, artists, and other residents who, even though they've literally been keeping our communities standing during this pandemic, they've struggled in silence to find the basics of rent and food for themselves. Even with some of our programs having to scale back due to the pandemic, our demand is higher than ever. Ask any one of our Churches of the Hill food bank sponsors or supporters, and they'll tell you. Our seniors in St. Paul's, injured workers and community members on ODSP, OW have also expressed heartache over AGIs. Living on a fixed income makes it even harder to manage multiple AGIs. These rent increases are in excess of the cost of living increases by a significant margin, placing many renters in between a rock and a hard place. It is also really difficult to know your last pennies are going towards an AGI, while right there within your own unit, you've got no cold or hot water, a toilet that always breaks down, or other repairs that the landlord never gets around to fix. It stings to be paying multiple AGIs for large project capital repairs while your own unit falls apart. It adds insult to injury when tenants' email, phone calls, and letters to corporate landlords often go unheard. These are the stories I'm hearing, and I know many in this chamber are hearing it too. My motion calling for a ban immediately on AGIs during COVID and at least 12 months after the official end of the pandemic will help Frank, who lives with a disability after a workplace injury in St. Paul's. Mr. B, didn't want his last name mentioned, is a tenant in our Midtown community who has told me he cannot afford a landline or a cell phone. We've communicated through postcards and letters via snail mail since last year, and next week he'll be calling me at a scheduled time for the first time via payphone. My office and I are helping Frank through his ODSP issues. As he says, purchasing groceries gets tighter and tighter by the month. He cannot afford another AGI. He cannot afford to move. He is stuck. I'm calling on the Conservative government to place an iron ring around tenants, not developers and billionaire investors and corporate property owners. Liza Butcher is one of our community members in St. Paul. She's the president of 70, 80 and 90 Heath Street West Tenants Association, a co-coordinator of Tenants Network Toronto, and an executive member of our Toronto St. Paul's Tenants Association network. Liza said, and I quote, "I stand in firm support of MPP Andrews' motion to freeze AGIs until at least 12 months after COVID-19 ends officially. In my buildings, we get AGIs every year, and when Premier Ford left AGIs out of his 2021 rent freeze, it meant that for us, it wasn't a rent freeze at all." Liza and many other Hollyborn property tenants during the pandemic are still receiving AGIs. These AGIs can result in tenants paying literally hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on top of their rent in any given year or over the course of their tenancy. This could mean $5 grand, $10 grand, $20 grand more on top of the rent during the duration of their tenancy. This causes chronic financial burdens, which of course simultaneously sweeten the pockets of corporate landlords. And it contributes to our community members having to leave the neighbourhoods they know and love, leaving all their support systems behind, local community parks, schools, daycare, small business and memories behind. Not to mention AGIs drive up the rental market, which only makes the affordable housing crisis worse. And it surely doesn't help young people or anybody across the life spectrum who wants to one day become a homeowner. Above guideline rent increase applications have increased by 250% in the past 6 years, according to a report by the group Renovictions TO. Over 84% of AGI applications were from corporate landlords rather than mom-and-pop landlords. Mom-and-pop landlords, by far and large, are not the issue. The Renovictions TO report concludes that if AGIs are intended to incentivize landlords who are otherwise unwilling to perform repairs and upgrades, there are ways to do so that do not include passing costs to tenants. It is clear that AGIs for many are a cash grab for corporate landlords looking to make extra profits on their tenants. And I quote from a CBC article, "The province's rent freeze legislation has seemingly done little to stem the rising number of AGI applications. In the first 5 months following the legislation's enactment, landlords filed 266 AGIs in Ontario. Of those, 91 were in Toronto." Speaker, we need real supports for tenants, especially during the pandemic. The government could make real strides towards a recovery, one that includes our NDP calls for rent control, for scrapping vacancy decontrol, scrapping unfair evictions, and fixing the landlord and tenant board so people can find justice, so they can be treated equitably, like human beings. Our official opposition housing, urban planning and tenants' right critic, MPP for University Rosedale, is in full support of my motion 157, calling for the ban on AGIs during the pandemic. In fact, this Thursday, the member from University Rosedale and I are co-hosting a virtual event on tenants' rights and a fair LTB. Virtual landlord-tenant board hearings make fighting AGIs that much harder for tenants, and we'll be discussing this with our communities, along with another piece of government legislation that seeks to silence tenant advocacy, namely the proposed fine of up to $25,000 against tenants recording and sharing problematic and inequitable experiences at the Landlord-Tenant Board as per the government's Bill 276, Schedule 27. This is yet another move that will hurt tenants. I've called on this government to remove any proposed fines against already financially burdened tenants in a previous motion. Today, I am asking the government to support my motion 157 calling for a ban on AGIs. People need security and affordability now more than ever. Banning AGIs will help provide the real rent increase freeze tenants need now. And if the government won't listen to me or the opposition, I hope that they will listen to some of these people who have nothing to benefit than a few more pennies in their pockets for food. Bill Worrell is the chair of Oakwood Vaughan Community Organization. In this pandemic, some of the hardest hit members of our communities are tenants, many of whom are going to unsafe work or working at home in crowded conditions in lockdown. We've heard too many stories of AGIs forced upon our vulnerable community members. This has got to stop now. Motion 157 will provide critical protection for members of our community already under huge stress. Alejandra Ruiz Vargas, chair of East York Acorn, said, Acorn members have been fighting for a real rent freeze for a long time, so this motion is a dream come true for tenants all over the province. Allowing above-the-guideline increases during this pandemic is absurd for a government that is claiming to have delivered a quote-unquote rent freeze. The fact is the landlords are using AGIs to continue to increase rents and push out tenants from their homes during the pandemic, and it has got to stop. Acorn demands a real rent freeze with real rent control, with vacancy control, and fully supports this motion from MPP Andrew. Patrick Lassad is a tenant advocate and chair of the 100 Vaughan Tenant Association. As a renter and the chair of my building, I support this motion. This represents a critical step toward keeping housing affordable for renters during the pandemic, many of whom are suffering from reduced income, an unstable job market, and unsafe work conditions at the time. Pausing AGIs will also dramatically improve work-from-home conditions for many renters during the pandemic, as it will remove a major incentive for disruptive, non-urgent daytime construction, which I have written to the government about, in rental buildings during COVID. I urge other members of Ontario to lend their support to MPP Andrew's motion. Thank you, and I'll continue the rest of my
Thank you.